to keep track of everything. There's so much going on. Um, I was just looking at a DOJ indictment of two guys up in Minnesota from the country of Cameroon. And that whole thing is quite the interesting rabbit hole, too. They indicted them for doing terrorism in Cameroon. And I'll have to save that for another day. But yeah, it's crap's happening everywhere. Very interesting time to be alive, obviously, if you know what we know. So, you feel like you need. Huh?
Sorry about being late. I had to reboot completely, and amen about what a time to be alive.
Yeah, it's crazy.
On Rumble, it still says it's still showing the preview.
Okay, well, it'll come on in a minute.
Oh, never mind. There it is.
Okay.
Never mind. It's up.
Okay. So we're almost finished with this book. If we don't finish today, we will definitely finish tomorrow. And then we'll be moving on to something equally as exciting. So we've kind of covered the lay of the land in Colombia as far as the drug operations and the involvement of not only the UK and Israel and the CIA and Southcom. So this last segment of this chapter, before we move on to the last chapter, is about regionalization. And that's where they come up with the name, the Crystal Triangle, because obviously Peru and Bolivia for a period of time until Evo Morales gets in Bolivia. And even then in the mountain areas where there's not a lot of government involvement in Bolivia, what they basically do is just kind of move crops around. And the author describes the regionalization. He uses two terms: the balloon effect, which is basically that, like the clowns manipulating the balloon, the air just goes somewhere else. He also uses the term hydraulic effect, which again is the same thing. You push down and the fluid just goes other places. So it's not like any of this was ever to eliminate the drug trafficking, which is the whole point. He describes the regionalization of the cocaine trade that began in the 1970s when Latin American fumigation was first carried out. And this is the interesting part for me. You guys will know. It was carried out using CIA proprietary airlines. That's interesting. So the CIA is taking out literally the crops that they don't want people to have, which are the people that they don't control. And it says the CIA planes used were evergreen. And again, for you guys that have been with me for a very long time, you guys know that I worked on those airplanes as a maintenance troop for Evergreen Airlines. Not in Colombia, but all of those airlines, the aircraft, the 727s and those types of aircraft were cycled through UPS operations because Evergreen had a whole bunch of contracts for UPS, like for spare planes, for maintenance, which is where I worked for UPS, was as a contract maintenance person. My actual employer was Evergreen. And it says that they were piloted by both Mexican pilots and CIA contractors, most of which had flown for the CIA in Vietnam. It also says, which is true, Evergreen acquired most of the aircraft from the CIA proprietary airline Intermountain Aviation. And we've talked about them before. The company with the contract for all of the aircraft maintenance was in Mexico, though. It was called E-Systems. Now, why is that important? If you look up E-Systems, they have a very interesting history. And by the way, If you look them up on a browser like Brave, you're going to get very, especially if you also um, look up Air Asia. So E-Systems acquired the CIA proprietary airline called Air Asia. So if you couple those two on Brave, which I just did, you get one response that says absolutely nothing. However, if you do it on Yandex, you get mountains of responses. And guess one of them is called the Dedicated Chemtrail Fleet. Um, one of the articles that was written. So you can see the difference in the material that you can find on Yandex versus the other places. And it's important to do both of those so you can get the full effect. One of them starts out saying, during this time, E-Systems acquired Electronic Communications Inc. and Air Asia of Taiwan. So again, you see how all of this drug stuff, it doesn't matter what continent we're on, it doesn't matter which hemisphere we're in, it all ties in to everything together. But what's even more interesting is, I don't know if you guys have used the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Covert Politics. It's a very interesting website, and it's got a lot of information on it. A lot of information that oftentimes is very hard to dig through when you're looking for something specific. So in there, doing a search on E-Systems, you find out that there's an entire laundry list of assassinations on using aircraft, like a plane crash or whatever, regarding aircraft that has systems on it. And so if you go, they have over 400 potential government assassinations involving plane crashes. Now, of course, we know plane crashes are real. When you start digging into E-Systems and you find out how widespread the components that this CIA-tied company has, it literally will blow your mind. So just to give you an idea, it's headquartered in Dallas, and it says that it's a defense electronics company that develops high technology systems for aircraft surveillance, aircraft ground land navigation system. And of course, we covered the aircraft 007 that was flying to Korea out of Alaska, that the one Senator was on, that's navigation system was blamed for them flying over Russia and eventually being shot down as a result of that. So again, this research, and if you actually go in, don't just read the book, go in and look at every aspect of the book that we're covering, you find some very revealing things. They're also now into intelligence and reconnaissance, command and control. And so if you have nefarious players in these chains of intelligence, they're obviously able to give you the information they want you to have. They also are involved in air traffic control and use communication systems that are deployed throughout NATO. Again, all very important to the story of Operation Gladio. And I will take this, this is about the funding of it, and I will send it over to Bridget for her to drop into the pill, because I'm not that multitaskable. So anyway, I just wanted to explain to you who E-Systems was and why it's important in the story of drug operations and what they control. So the author goes on and says that despite all of these anti-drug programs, not a single important trafficker ever got arrested. Now, of course, we know they took out Escobar, but they assassinated him. They don't want anybody that has any information, especially as it relates to their role in it, ever talking in public. So they're not going to arrest the major players in this. In the early 70s, there was political pressure from Nixon on the Southern Cone governments of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile and Brazil to pass anti-drug legislation to counter the heroin threat. Nixon's administration was the first to officially declare the war on drugs as official drug diplomacy and looking at Latin America. Now, again, I just have to say this, and I'm sorry, repeat myself for you guys that's been with me the whole time, but we have new people every day. Nixon's war on drugs, the net effect of it was not in any way reducing drugs at all. That's a matter of fact. Drugs escalated. What he actually did was work with the French president, and they openly declared war on the Corsican mafia in France. And why is that important? Because the Corsican mafia was basically a competitor of the Sicilian mafia, of which the CIA was in bed with. And they killed over 300, to include leading lab technicians, the scientists that had created the world's premier #4 heroin. And no one could surpass that. And as long as that was on the market, it was always going to gather the highest price in the heroin market. And so by eliminating the Corsican mafia, they basically eliminated the competition. And that's a reoccurring pattern in all of this. And they basically laid waste to the Corsican mafia. So that allowed the Sicilian mafia even more power along with their cohorts in the CIA. So in 1987, the international press was reporting on the balloon effect with increasing trafficking, corruption, and violence linked to drug trade coming out of Brazil and Paraguay. The Southern Cone had become crucial for drug traffickers seeking new routes, locations for cocaine laboratories, and money laundering centers. The Reagan-Bush White House was instrumental in what the author refers to as regionalization. Officials in the enforcement section of Treasury monitored sharp increases of capital inflowing to primarily Miami banks and Los Angeles banks later on. And they connected this to the drug trafficking. Now, keep in mind that in the 70s is when BCCI and Nugent Hand Bank was created, which are CIA front banks for money laundering. And they had banks in Miami, thanks to Paul Helliwell, and Castle Banks in the Bahamas, that was facilitating the money laundering into the United States. Detailed information on money laundering was brought to the DEA and Justice Department, and after some media exposés, Reagan was finally forced to act. Operation Greenback was launched to prosecute money launderers. However, according to federal prosecutors, Bush wasn't really too interested in doing any of that, and they terminated the program. William Bennett, the first director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the position that came about. Sorry about that. Somebody's at the front door. Hey, stop it. He became known as the drug czar. Um, he followed Bush's lead by implementing a historic no questions asked policy for US banks, making it possible for an estimated $8 billion in deposits in Miami and Los Angeles to remain there because they weren't going to ask any questions. Again, everything labeled to us for the public's consumption was a lie. It was all. Hold on a second. Okay. Um, my daughter just showed up with the grandbaby. The dogs are very excited. They love the baby. Okay. So, um, no one in the Washington, D.C. is interested in doing any of this, but to placate us, they name a drug czar, they have a war on drugs. They're just covering everything up. So, Reagan dropped, let's see. So, a small bank in Panama was pressured by the US government to plead guilty. That bank was Banco de Occident, a major financial institution that the Medellin cartel had been using. You know, Pablo Escobar, the guy they don't like, Robin Hood. Yeah. So they pressured that bank that they had been used because they're the competition to plead guilty. Throughout the cocaine decade, any attempt to investigate US profits from the drug trade to prosecute money launderers was undermined by the people in the White House to keep it all quiet. Drug processing requires ether and acetone, which are imported into the Crystal Triangle. Raphael Pearl of the Congressional Research Service, the public policy research arm of the US Congress, estimated that more than 90% of the chemicals used to produce cocaine came from the United States. In the 9 months before the announcement of George H.W. Bush's drug war in 1989, Colombian police reportedly seized 1.5 million gallons of the precursor chemicals, many found in drums with U.S. chemical companies' logos on them. A CIA study concluded that the U.S. exports of these chemicals far exceeded any legal commercial purpose. The chemical companies remained off limits for investigations and monitoring by drug like DEA enforcement. Every bit of that was political. Most DEA offices have only one agent working in the chemical divisions. A U.S. official said, "Raids on the corporate headquarters of chemical corporations in Manhattan are impossible because they're located in the financial district of the U.S." From all available evidence, 5 plausible factors may have contributed to the regionalization of the cocaine trade. A massive and continuous US propaganda campaign that the drug problem had to be resolved at the source rather than the financial destination in the US. Number 2, discrete and incremental penetration of cocaine into regional economies and their societies, like the narco elite we've talked about. Number 3, consistent funding for the supply side strategy like Plan Colombia. In other words, we're paying for it. Number 4, an intensification of both covert and overt economic operations because they're propping up the financial institutions with the covert funding being laundered to banks in the United States. Number 5, the gradual sealing off of investigations by the United States. By the end of the cocaine decade, the Boston Globe reported this piece, and I'm going to quote: "There are two camps on drug policy. One is made up of those who emphasize supply side strategies to cut off the flow, like cocaine, before they reach the American public. This includes virtually all US politicians, at least when they speak in public. The other is made up of people who have examined the results of past and present law enforcement efforts, considered the complexities of America's relationship with other countries and the power of capitalism and marketplace, and conclude that supply side strategies will not work. The group argues that the answer is found on the demand side, that incorporates treatment and rehabilitation programs with a propaganda campaign to discourage drug use. One element would be an evaluation of the decriminalization of some drugs, possibly even dangerous addictive ones like heroin and cocaine, so that the use by adults is regulated and taxed. The decriminalization stressed the threats to democracy that come through a corruption of police, judges, and politicians, through the melding of police and military forces in the name of national security, and through special wartime curtailment of civil liberties," unquote. Before the Bolivian cocaine coup in 1980, Paraguay was the first country in Latin America to publicly be exposed for its involvement in the drug trade. Paraguay in the early 70s was a vital center for the Corsican mafia, leading to the development of a vast international heroin trafficking network supplied from Turkey and the Corsican mafia in France. Corsicans' coordination of the transportation of heroin from France to the United States via Paraguay. The CIA used such networks as transit stops in transporting Asian heroin, the kind Chiang Kai-shek was setting up in Taiwan, to the US with the help of corrupt high-ranking government and military officials, as it did with the AAA cocaine. And as with the AAA cocaine, in turn, did with their favored French connection. That was until Nixon took them out. Paraguay's vast region, a virtually unpatrolled wilderness with over 900 clandestine airstrips, provided an ideal base for planes to land and take off. It is believed that over 50% of the chemicals used to process cocaine went to Paraguay and then into Colombia, Peru, or wherever. The institutionalization of cocaine in Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru provided the ideal environment for the trade. Hence, the contemporary narco-military network, composed of military and government officials that are actively involved with intelligence agencies and organized crime, based throughout Latin America, North America, and Europe, all converge in Miami. Cocaine laboratories have been found in northern and western Brazil. Before we move on from Paraguay, let me just tie in our earlier conversation about Reverend Moon and his Moonies. I mentioned then that they had purchased over 400 hectares in Paraguay, because they're involved too. Precursor chemicals are produced and transported through Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. And after the 1989 US invasion of Panama, Uruguay, and Chile all become players too. The UN International Narcotics Control Board reported in 1994 said that Argentina and Chile, formerly classified as secondary or marginal transit or consumption points, as not only important transit sites, but major consumers and money laundering centers. Now, you know why they had to overthrow Chile and Argentina, and all the rest of them, to include Brazil. New cocaine routes emerged in Brazil that cut through Brazilian cities and into Europe, where cocaine consumption was on the rise. In the slums of Rio de Janeiro, crack cocaine had taken hold. Military style police armed with assault rifles had been repelled by drug gangs, just like in Los Angeles. Multi tons of cocaine are headed to Europe, and poor African countries have experienced a boom in trafficking and drug use. The shift to Europe came as a result of the saturated US market in the 80s and 90s to yield higher profits, to control the people. That's what this is all about: destabilization and control. Let's dumb down the people, get them addicted to drugs, create all kinds of havoc, criminality, so they can control the countries. The Southern Cone continues to play a role of transshipment points for cocaine produced throughout, destined for the US and European markets. The regionalization of cocaine trade, which includes coca cultivation, cocaine processing, chemical transportation, and money laundering, can be considered as a Latin American component of US financial imperialism. In classical economics terms, if supply at the source of the crystal triangle is restricted, then the commodity price will rise, and theoretically, consumer demand will decrease. By restricting supply, the price of cocaine on US streets will increase, and it would reduce demand because you wouldn't be able to afford it. Decades of organization and movement of capital, narcotics, and technology demonstrate that the corporate finance has driven the global trade. Shortly before the global financial crisis, a Wall Street Journal report said this, quote, "The price of cocaine, the pure version, not crack, has kept falling. In the early 1980s, the price of a gram of cocaine was about $600. By the late 1990s, it had fallen to $200. According to the DEA, the street price of a gram of cocaine in 2005 was $20. In New York, $30. In Los Angeles, $100. In Denver, $125. In the cocaine decade, a pure gram of cocaine sold for $600 in the US. Since then, cocaine prices, regardless of the quality, fell sharply, making it more accessible. The global financial crisis in 2008 saw a spike of about $160 in 2010, which brought prices closer to the 1990 level. So far, the neoliberal policies guiding the war on drugs have neither stopped the cocaine trade nor undermined any aspect of it. Globally, Washington's efforts appear to be more stabilizing for the cocaine market than negative to it. The relocation strategy in Colombia has had no meaningful impact on the price of cocaine, its consumption, or any other aspect of it. The key measure of the strategy is also coca production. Given the counterproductive results of fumigation, the amount of land under coca cultivation in South America was approximately 100 acres. Provides a more realistic picture than those of official estimates. In 2004, Colombia has produced twice as much cocaine as its neighbor Peru or Bolivia. At the time, they were producing 80% of the world's supply. Now it's closer to 98%, which is why I have a problem even talking about Venezuela. Sorry. In 2001, the US State Department reported the coca cultivation in Colombia had peaked until now. The State Department's annual International Narcotics Control Strategy report, which isn't worth the paper it's written on, said the year's most noteworthy accomplishment was to keep the South American coca crop from expanding significantly? Well, they failed. Given the data produced by the US State Department, the US Council on Foreign Relations concludes that the coca production had not decreased. There is, quote, an inability of the US to assess the changing conditions in Latin America or reorienting its policies, unquote, because they have to lie to us. The area of land under coca cultivation has increased in both Bolivia and Peru, and in Colombia, the coca has also relocated beyond its borders. Supply side programs allow coca to be relocated, cocaine to be exported, and trade to be regionalized, suggesting there's a hidden level of coca cultivation and production within the Crystal Triangle, i.e., covertly. Even all of it should be covert, but of course we know a lot of it, but there's even more in addition to that, is what they're insinuating. And it goes on to say that in the dynamics of quantitative and speculative assessments, the size and market value of the cocaine trade, the Uribe government insisted that fumigation had been effective and pointed to results from other surveys conducted by the UN Office of Drug and Crime. They are the only studies that gave Uribe's argument any credence, both of which were drastically flawed. The US Colombian drug diplomacy, Colombia had accepted the UN survey data and not always those produced by the US government. The drug diplomacy between Colombia and the US can best be understood by a negotiated relationship, that is, quid pro quo, between US imperialism, the narco elite, and the mutual dependence on cocaine. They have a diagram in the book that talks about the different years dating back from 93 and going forward to 2000 in the amount of production. So what's interesting to note is both Bolivia, and we understand why, because they basically became the Taliban of getting all of the drugs out of their country. And they basically legalized the coca production and only allowed it to be used for indigenous regions, the tea and pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. So they went from 1993 with 47,000 metric tons down to 14, because the 14 was the legitimate market. In Colombia, they went from approximately 40,000 in 7 years to 136,000. And Peru went from 109,000 down to 34. So literally it's all moving to Colombia because the CIA, the Colombian government, the death squads, and the narco terrorists control Colombia. So he mentions, and again, let me just put this in perspective. This book was written in 2011. He says, the author says, in recent developments, the Chiquita Banana International Company, the successor to United Fruit, one of the best known US monopolies, pleaded guilty in March of 2007 to providing $1.7 million in funding over 7 years to the Colombian AUC. That's the death squads protecting the narco guys in return for protection, because they were exploiting Colombia land just like they did in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, and everybody else. Yeah, pleaded guilty to paying protection money of $1.7 million to terrorists. According to Terry Collingsworth, a lawyer and international rights advocate who led the multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the corporation, quote, this is a landmark case, maybe the biggest terrorism case in the history unquote. Chiquita pleaded guilty to one count of doing business with a terrorist group and agreed to pay a fine of $25 million. Under the agreement, none of the company's execs would be criminally charged. Now, I thought funding terrorism was a bad thing, but no criminal charges. Between 1997 and February 2004, Chiquita, i.e., United Fruit, made more than 100 payments to the AUC, including over 50 payments totaling $850,000 after the State Department had listed it as a terrorist organization. Prior to 1997, Chiquita had made payments to the FARC, but that was before the FARC had been labeled a terrorist organization. So they're just paying people all over. Don't hit us. We're just exploiting all of your farmland. It is known that Chiquita made over $200 million in profit since the AUC was listed as a terrorist organization in 2001. Chiquita's fine amounted to less than half of the $51 million that it made from the 2004 sale of the Colombian subsidiary. The U.S. transnational corporation was barely punished for funding narco terrorism or buying protection, whatever you want to call it. Beyond the social, environmental, and economic impact of narco colonialism, there are political implications for U.S. imperialism in Latin America. The BBC reported that the imperial project had spilled across the border into Ecuador, triggering fears of Colombiaization of Ecuador. Ecuadorians feared that if Colombia became the next Vietnam, Ecuador would become the next Cambodia. A good fear to have, because that would have been most likely to happen. The Colombian narco elite had bought land in northern Ecuador province, basically to turn them into cocoa plantations. They also spread out into Peru, which allowed coca development further into the Amazons. In several of the villages that were not under the control, but located in the Amazon, were subjected to the fumigation, basically contaminating the water, the land, and everything else. Fears of the Colombianization of Latin America with cocaine are substantiated with the development of cocaine in chemical manufacturing labs set up in Bolivia, throughout the Brazilian Amazon, as well as Argentina and northern Chile. The narco elite is emerging in countries outside of the Crystal Triangle. In the inter-American drug trade, Colombian middlemen are being replaced by distributors in Mexico. And that's how we end up with the Mexican cartels. In an effort to distract attention from the Colombian source, the past decade has seen the Mexican drug war, look over here, become the apparent focus of drug war propaganda. Don't look at the source, just look at the networks. Because if those guys get taken out, we don't care. We're still growing it. Colombian cocaine laboratories situated near rivers and in thick tropical jungles are refining and exporting cocaine to southern cone countries. To the powers that be in Washington, this may send mixed signals about imperial relations in Latin America. The gang-related violence in Rio de Janeiro, known euphemistically as the White Republic for the color of cocaine, and the involvement of government officials in the drug trade could lead to possible problems in Brazil, which of course we know it did. Cocaine cartels resembling the paramilitary militia of Colombia have invaded small towns, turning inhabitants into drug addicts and mules and drug couriers because they threatened their families. Growing market competition among the land-owning and national business class, i.e., the narco elite, could lead to cocaine wars of the kind seen during the cocaine decade. The current drug war in Mexico between drug cartels and security forces looks exactly like Colombia in 1980. If the political environment gives rise to a new Pablo Escobar, it would bring a whole new challenge to the CIA's control. The regionalization of cocaine has expanded to countries traditionally more important to the US, like Argentina and Brazil, but also to other countries that have resisted narco colonialism, like once Evo Morales was elected in Bolivia. But they didn't, again, they didn't actively participate in the illicit drug trafficking. Not that some of their plants weren't eventually sold by some of their people to the narco terrorists. I'm not saying that. But he legalized the production of the coca leaf for teas and medicine. Also, one of the potential was Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. In Bolivia, Morales had banned the DEA from his country. He cited the book "The Big White Lie" by Michael Levine, who basically exposed all of this. Another great book, and said that he didn't want any of those people in his country because he knew that they would attack him because he was not a U.S. controlled asset. Resistance to U.S. imperialism has intensified in Colombia with some outside influence, but not among the narco elite or the politicians. Because again, that's why you have to have death squads. Anybody that stands up and protests is going to get killed. They talk a little bit about Chavez and him having a kind of almost like a campaign to embolden the resistance in Colombia to push back against the U.S. control of the narcotics there, which obviously would put him at odds with the U.S. State Department, which of course is why we all know Chavez as a communist. And I'm not pro-Chavez. I'm just saying anybody that speaks up against this control in these networks automatically by default becomes a communist or a radical Islamic terrorist and becomes a target. So the author goes on to say, alongside Cuba and FARC, Venezuela then became part of the axis of evil because you can't have anybody speaking out about U.S. imperialism in Latin America. The government of President Rafael Correa in Ecuador could leave Colombia sandwiched between two governments that are anti-U.S., which was the case at the time. There was a U.S. military air base on Ecuador's Pacific coast. Correa had argued that Washington must let him open a military base in Miami. I love it. So basically, he ran on telling the U.S. that if you're going to keep your air base here, I get to have an air base in the U.S. That didn't go over very well. And here's the justification the U.S. government used for keeping the base open. They said the base is vital for counter-narcotics surveillance in drug running routes. You can go ahead and laugh. You got to be kidding me. No. They operate with impunity at the time. So, under the pressure from George W. Bush administration, President Uribe neutralized Chavez's growing influence in the Colombian conflict by dismissing his mediating efforts that had commenced in 2007, preferring instead his close ally, the Catholic Church hierarchy, backed by the governments of France, Spain, and Switzerland, which have corporations that had all invested heavily in Colombia. Since the Colombian Ecuador border crisis, Venezuela and Colombia relationships basically had kind of normalized once Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos took over. And there were obvious hiccups in that because a lot of scandals broke out because he was revealing what his predecessor had done, to include bad things to Venezuela. Some of that included an ongoing parapolitica scandal in which Santos had repeatedly said Uribe will not be investigated under his government. The International Criminal Court investigation, an alleged war crime involving the use of the Red Cross emblem used during military rescue operations against the FARC. So, in other words, Uribe was putting the Red Cross flying military missions on helicopters while they were attacking the FARC. Yeah, but hey, we're not going to investigate that. Let bygones be bygones. There was also an alleged assassination attempt by Colombian government and their CIA backers against President Chavez, which of course is a bad thing. They were involved in electoral fraud, doctoring police and judicial records to erase paramilitary death squad hits. It also says the most serious of these traceable to Uribe, the disappearance of more than 250,000 Colombians over the past 20 years, surpassing the recorded mass murders committed by Argentina, hi buddy, Chile, Uruguay in the previous century combined. That's the result. Hey buddy. That's the result of the Colombian death squads. 250,000, surpassed everybody else. So, when compared to the cartel-run narco economy of the 1980s, which provided a degree of order and stability for the economic interest of the narco elite and U.S. imperialism, the regionalization of the cocaine trade has brought financial benefits, but also increasing resistance to privatization and decentralization of the economic system. The relocation and regionalization strategy prevails as U.S. imperialism works furiously to isolate and undermine anti-imperialist politics in the region. It's good to have your own death squads. Colombia was never a traditional coca growing nation until U.S. imperialism and cocaine intersected. Regionalization is important to U.S. imperialist goals that were made possible through the supply side programs of Plan Colombia. Build it and they will come. The days when the vast majority of cocaine was bound for the U.S. are long gone, said a DEA official. Now it goes everywhere. And that's it. So we will finish the book tomorrow. Where did Bridget go? Bridget got dropped. Let me get her back up. Let me get Stellar in. Okay. Anybody got anything to add to that? Shelley over, Shelley the Kiwi, our New Zealand expert, says we have better chances taking on the tarantulas than we do the chemicals they spray to get rid of them. I'm sure that's true. I'm sure the tarantulas is just the excuse they use to spray you guys. So, Bridget.
They're fuckers. What I mean is, they just keep doing that same garbage over and over and over again. It's almost like they got a handbook.
They do.
Um, it's their playbook. It's called Operation Gladio, and those fiends need to just be obliterated. And I still think Jimmy's first word's going to be Gladio.
No, he says Dada pretty good now. I'm just waiting for him to start saying Nona. He just
Aww.
it's so funny because he was our play area. We've got like a sitting room off the dining room, and that's where all of his toys are, and it's kind of right beside where my office is. And he just comes wandering in through the office doors, these sliding glass doors, and he just comes right in and starts walking around. Um,
he owns the place, you know.
He's walking so well now. He can get himself up in the middle of the floor. He doesn't have to crawl over to the wall or anything. It's just, I'm so glad to be home.
Aww.
So, anyway, and then they're going to move.
Of course.
All right. Stellar, go ahead. Did you have something?
I wanted to say thank you for you and Hamster and Bridget sending me the link so that my mom could listen in on the stuff that you guys are talking about this morning. She was not even aware of a lot of the stuff, and she was like arguing back and forth and stuff like that. So it does hit a lot of the stuff that you guys were bringing up. I'm sorry, I only came in late today, just now, but so I didn't know about today's ones. But just bringing up what you guys were talking about this morning and stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of what you guys were talking about, she was familiar with some of it, not so much with others. People that she thought that were okay, like her, my dad had talked about, were not okay. So it was mind blowing. She just shakes her head at everything. She's confused, but I don't think it's the dementia or her illness that's making her that way. I think it's just because of how everything is, because everything that she was taught was opposite of what you guys were talking about today. If that makes any sense.
It does. And for those of you who don't know, Stellar's mom is from Korea, and this is why a lot of this stuff hits home for her. And yeah, but Stellar, how different would that have been from us 3 years ago? Literally everything we thought we knew was a lie, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what you said. Yes, everything was a complete lie. She honestly thought, just like how I did and like most of us did, that we were on the side of right, trying to prevent communism, but in actuality, all of the my mom lived through the war. She was a young girl, young woman, during that time, the Korean War conflict and stuff like that. She would hide in, she would tell me places that they would hide, because they would snatch up people on a regular basis and stuff. So everything that she thought was real, in actuality, everything, and we're talking, my mom is 88 years old now. Everything that she was led to believe, is totally false. And she does have a hard time understanding, and she just shakes her head and says, I wish Daddy was here. I wish Daddy was here. But yeah, her family is still broken apart. Some are in the north, some are in the south and stuff like that, because of how they did the DNC lines and even how that whole thing was put together. The whole thing is just,
well,
sorry.
and make no mistake. Obviously the war was real, but what people were fighting for, that we were told, is a lie. We were told that Kim was fighting to make the entire continent communist. He was not. He was fighting to unify the Korean peninsula because he knew that the US was never going to allow that to happen. They made that very clear at the beginning when they started sabotaging the North with stay-behind units. It became very apparent with the mass extermination of nationalists that wanted a unified Korean peninsula and all foreigners out. That was their whole thing. They were unified because they had been under occupation, basically a colony where the Japanese had stolen people from the Korean peninsula to go do dirty deeds all over the Asian theater in war after war after war, conquering different countries. So they wanted everybody out, and they were unified in that. Now, could it have been messy as opposed to the nationalists that was more agricultural in the South and more North Korea at the time was in 1950 was very industrially advanced because that's where all of the industry was. That's where they did all their manufacturing, and that's why the US wanted it. Just like what's happening in Donbass with the Ukrainian conflict. It's not enough to just have Ukraine as a neutral country. That's not allowed. And they realize, which is what happened in the immediate aftermath of 2014, that Donbass is where all of the industry was. It's where all the minerals were. The rest of it is a breadbasket. And so they were not going to allow Russian sympathy people to maintain control of the Donbass region. So in the immediate aftermath of 2014, they're going to basically displace all of those people. And the attack began immediately. That is not unlike, and that's the point I keep trying to make. Ukraine is not unique in any way. It happened in the Congo with Katanga, where all the uranium was. We have watched this play out so many times. And that's what Bridget and I, as we went country by country, it was like all of us collectively would go, son of a bitch, they did it again. And then we moved to Vietnam and we're like, son of a bitch, they did it again. You just see this pattern over and over and over again. Because if they break apart a country, it's easier to control. Bridget, you had your hand up? No? Okay.
Trying to get back.
Okay.
Popping and posting, and trying to make bread. So, yeah, well, you echoed just what I was going to say to Stellar. Her mom is not alone. I have a friend, as some of you may know, who grew up actually, her husband grew up in Germany, and she grew up in Austria, and her parents went through during the Nazi War and saw all of these things taking place at the time. And when they came over here, they were guilt tripped by the United States anyway. And we've all been brainwashed. I guess that was my point. We've all been brainwashed, and even today, there are times where I'll turn around and I'll see something. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm still indoctrinated. How did I not see what they were doing? And that's why if anybody hasn't gotten to see, the Colonel did a video this morning on South Korea and and their plans and all of these connections. And I really highly recommend you go listen to it because it really, really lays it all out. And what you're seeing play out today is what we've been recording you, and so that you can see through these headlines. You've got the Gladio prescription, Lasix now, and you can't take them off, and it's just incredible how they just keep repeating.
So I have to shout out to Shelly the Kiwi. She says, wait till SR gets home from work and I tell him the Colonel said I was an expert. I love it. You definitely tell SR I said that. That's hilarious. Mager Sarge says I need to develop a Operation Gladio hoodie in anticipation of winter. I will take that under advisement, Magar, only because in Florida, we don't have a hoodie season for real.
But we do. Ooh,
yes, I know. And
I vote.
Okay, all right.
Also, a ball cap. Get a ball cap so that we can put our ponytail in the back too.
Okay, all right.
Please, great idea.
Ball caps and hoodies. Got it. My marketing director is my daughter that just came over, so I will relay that to her. We'll get on that. Okay, so that's it for today. We will finish the book, like I said, tomorrow, and we have a couple of books waiting to be on the queue for exposure that I think will dovetail into this nicely. And we probably are going to stay on the drug part of this and the money laundering piece of this, only because I think with the most recent events, it's going to be the most significant for us to understand what's going on today. And back to the show that we did this morning, what I really want people to take away from that is we all know that US corporations are corrupt, but we fail to understand culturally how corrupt other countries' corporations are. And obviously, we got a lot of, not a lot, we got a few pushbacks. I don't want to over dramatize of, hey, that was not that big of a deal when it comes to Hyundai. But once you understand the corporate culture that the company, and I'm not talking about their cars. I owned one. I owned a Genesis. I owned a Santa Fe. I'm not talking about their cars. And you can like or not like their cars. I don't care. I'm talking about the corporate culture. And that corporate culture is from, if you imagine whether you like Fords or not, or whether you like GMs or not, and Ford's probably the better one back in the day, not so much now, but it was a family ran company. And we know that Ford was involved in funding the Nazis in Germany, and they had a, a agreements, and there was manufacturing being done well after the war was underway in France at their Ford plant there. Those have all been talked about early on when we talked through Anthony Sutton's book. If you guys didn't know that that was out there very early on, we did Anthony Sutton's 3 books that talked about all of those funding. So it's not just the corporate rot in the United States. Some countries, and South Korea being one of them, comes from a very different culture. Criminality and corruption and backdoor deals and hit jobs and everything else is built into the corporate pay for play. And as I mentioned with the articles that Bridget found, you can see the impact of how the Unification Church was used and was part of that corrupt corporate. And those companies are ran like little fiefdoms. They are ran by the family, and they don't give a crap about stakeholder investment. They don't give a crap about what they do and how it affects the shareholders in the companies that actually sell stock to their companies. They make decisions based on what's best for their family, and that's it. And so from an investor standpoint, understanding the culture of these companies is very important, and where they come from. Go ahead, Stellar.
I was also going to bring up very much so what you're saying. Very, very, their culture is a lot different than ours. Okay, so like the Hyundai thing. So the Hyundai is the father. Kia is owned by the son. Kia was doing better. Kia was doing better than Hyundai was, and so Kia's the son stepped back so that the father's business would do better than the son's. It's very cultural how they do their stuff, and yes, they're kind of brutal.
They're very, yes, very, yeah. All right. So that's it for today. Thanks everyone for being here. Like I said, we'll finish up the book tomorrow, and I will announce tomorrow what book we're going to go to next. Thanks
so we're at the same time every day again. So
yes.
We've got Colonel Towner and Operation Gladio regularly.
Yes.
Yes.
I am back home.
Okay. Yay. I'm so glad you're back
too. Yep. All right. Take care, everyone. See you guys later.